Hey, Larkin Rose here. Wanted to give an update on the interactive project thing I'm working on, which unfortunately doesn't have a title I like quite yet. Um, could talk about this for hours, but I want to make this as quick and succinct as possible, so I will break it down into chunks. First of all, the problem, statism, authoritarianism, the idea that legalizing evil makes it good. Not only does it make otherwise decent people implement and enforce immoral, violent aggression in the name of law enforcement, but it makes most of the victims go along with it and feel an obligation to basically fund authoritarian empires and go along with stupid laws and oppressive garbage and cooperate. So the problem is not a particular regime, the problem is the belief in authority in people's heads. If that changes, the regimes end. Battling one regime at a time and dealing with it on a practical basis doesn't do any good, including revolution doesn't do any good as long as people believe in authority, they're just going to build a new one. So, ending the belief in authoritarianism in the general public is the only solution, the only long-term solution to tyranny and oppression. Now, there are challenges to getting this done if you approach it from a practical standpoint and say, well, we think that arranging society on a voluntary basis without a ruling class would work better than having a ruling class as we have now. That approach doesn't work on very many people for several reasons. First of all, people are scared of the unknown. They're familiar with government. They don't know what there would be without it. And they've been trained to be scared of the idea of actual freedom, so they will predict, oh, if we don't have a ruling class, we'll all be violent cavemen and be killing and eating each other. And trying to have them understand economics and cause and effect takes a lot of effort. Every once in a while, somebody will understand it from that, from using that approach, but in my experience, that hasn't been very often. Incidentally, I'm basing what I'm talking about now in this project on almost 2 decades worth of personal experience of talking to statists. And I used to be a statist, of course, almost everyone was. And studying not just the philosophy and the concepts of liberty, which are fundamentally pretty simple, but the psychology of people and the things that get in the way of them understanding it and embracing freedom. It's like once upon a time, a lot of slaves used to think that slavery was proper and that's how things are, and they were scared of the idea of being free. Well, that's a mental problem. Like, never mind escaping the physical chains, the thing that has to happen first is escaping the mental chains. In order to get somebody out of the authoritarian mindset, in order to deprogram them out of statism, you don't actually have to take an external set of ideas and smash it into their heads. And that's the way most arguments and debates go. You believe this, I believe this, we're going to yell at each other until one of us changes our mind, which is probably never, because that hardly ever works. The belief in authority and government is inherently contradictory. In any individual, just by asking them questions about what they believe and what they advocate, I can lead them to contradictions inside their own head. Up until now, up until this project, the best scenario, the best situation I can think of for getting someone to question and give up their authoritarian indoctrination is a one-on-one discussion where they're actually open to thinking about things and it's calm, it's not adversarial, it's just discussing things. And I've done that with a lot of people. I've also done a lot of adversarial debates and arguments and, a whole range of different exchanges, one-on-one or one-on-100 or whatever. Until now, the best setting was somebody willing to sit down and think about things. Well, that isn't a very big percentage of the population that's willing to do that. And there's a very limited number of times that can be done. I'm me, there's a lot of other voluntarists, but if we're talking to the 7 billion statists out there, one at a time on a one-on-one personal basis, it's going to take forever to make a real dent in the mentality of the population of the world. And having a little handful of voluntarists here isn't going to help much if there's a whole world of statists with tanks and bombers that say, oh, nasty voluntarists, let's go blow them up. We have to get the numbers. Until now, until recently, I assumed that there wasn't really a way to replicate what I did in person. Which is walk people through these lines of questioning, because they'll bring up concerns and they'll answer different ways. But I can always lead them to the contradictions inside their own head. And I don't even have to point out the contradictions in their own head. So now I'm going to get into what this project actually does, because it is several steps better than the best one-on-one discussion could ever be, like the best one-on-one discussions I've ever had with people. The success rate I've found when it can actually be one-on-one and calm and not adversarial is pretty dang high. Well, this project will be way better than that. And the important thing is it can be replicated for 7 billion people at a time. And each person, it's a unique experience. It's not somebody just listening to a speech or reading a book or watching a video. It's actually an interactive thing where they guide the direction of the discussion, where their answers and their beliefs and their preferences and their values are the deciding factor in what they're going to advocate and believe in. So this project is going to be basically a discussion that anybody can do online, on their computer, on their iPhone, on their whatever, anything that it connects to the internet, and it's a back and forth discussion. Now, there are a lot of things about this that are not just philosophy, because if you tell somebody, hey, let's have a philosophical discussion, 99% of the world already tunes out. They don't care, they don't want to hear about it. They don't want to think about anything that's too inconvenient. This thing will sort of have the visuals of a video game. It will take place in a three-dimensional world, and it's very important that there are interesting visuals for people to follow along while they're thinking about things. So this thing is very visual. It takes place in a three-dimensional world. I'll show some examples of a thing I did ages ago that has nothing to do with this project, but it shows the computer-generated virtual reality and how you move around in the world. But this thing will basically be a model of the inside of your own brain. It's basically inviting the person to take a tour of their own brain and their own belief system. And it doesn't quite put it this way, but the goal being to see if there are contradictions that are making you, the user, not be in line with what you actually want, with what you actually believe. And so the tone of it throughout is not your belief system sucks, you're a bad person. The tone is there may be things that you've been raised to believe which actually get in the way of your goodness and your virtue and your good intentions and what you want the world to be. There's two huge amounts of work that have to be put into this. One is the flow chart. It's like an if-then chart. It's basically, it will ask a question and they can answer yes or they can answer no, or they can ask for elaboration, or there's some other options. But basically it breaks it down to simple things and then they answer yes or no. And there's a flow chart. So, well, if they answer yes, well then the next question is this, and then it's yes or no, and the next yes. So it's a flow chart that spreads out so anybody can answer any of the questions any way they want. And for any individual user, it feels like a linear back and forth discussion that follows. Each question depends upon the last answer he gave. And so you have this big flow chart and all the directions it can go, but for any given individual, it'll go one way and it'll feel like a back and forth discussion. I already have a narrator, female narrator with a nice voice, because psychologically that makes a huge difference. People are less likely to feel argumentative, having this calm discussion with a female narrator voice than they are with me, for example. People are familiar with the video, The Philosophy of Liberty, which has been around forever. I think one of the brilliant things about that is it breaks it down into these simple little cartoon character representations and explains liberty and self-ownership in a way that you kind of can't miss. It's the visuals are memorable, very simple, but very memorable, and it just makes the concept so clear. And I think just hearing concepts in words registers in people's brains so much less than if you have a visual concept. You hear the words, you see the concept, you see the representation in front of you. So what they're seeing is they're basically going through a physical tour of a representation of inside their brain. Now, it doesn't look like a mushy brain. It has, representations of, here's the memory, here's our perceptions, here's the, at some point I'll do a sketch and you can see how that works. Now, I have to build that entire world inside a computer with 3D rendering. It's something I've done before. I already know how to do it. I I already have the software. But it takes a lot of time to build an entire world. So visually, you're moving through this world as it's asking you about things, and you're basically examining your own brain. And it's very clear at the beginning about the fact that there's not going to be anything judgmental or argumentative in this. You, the user, you decide what's true and what's false. You decide right and wrong. You decide all of that. It's just a tool to let you look at your own brain. And the only reason that works is because you cannot be a statist without having giant contradictions. So it gently leads them to their contradictions and then lets them decide what to do about it. It never like jumps out and go, haha, that's a contradiction. It doesn't do anything to make them defensive. And the fact that there isn't another human being there, the narrator never says I or me, never argues anything. It's just asking questions, leading people through. The narrator doesn't even have a face. It's a voice that guides you through this 3D world. And you're always in charge, so they never have to feel defensive. And it says up front that if, you can try on an answer and later you can go back and change your answer. And that's one of the things that makes it really complicated to make, but a lot more effective. So it's not like, what's your answer? Yes or no? Ha ha ha. So they don't feel trapped. They can say yes, and then later they can say, well, maybe not always, and back up and change it, like in a real discussion. And the thing is, that's a perfect example of something that most people won't ever do in a real discussion, because especially if it feels at all adversarial, like we have different beliefs, and I just ask you something, and you gave an answer, and you're starting to feel uncomfortable with your answer, the natural thing to do is defend your answer, even if you now think it's stupid. Because people are in combat mode. No, I'm going to cling to whatever I said before because I don't want to admit, no, that was stupid, I was totally wrong. But in this setting where it invites you, it's like, try it out. Try out an answer, come back, try the other one, see what you think. There's no judgment, there's no being wrong, and it tells the user this up front. This isn't like a quiz that you either get it right or wrong. It's just a way to help you look into your own brain and see what's going on there. Because that's all you actually have to do to deprogram people out of authoritarianism. But it basically lets people in this visual world ask very simple questions, and they cover things like, it won't be worded this way, but like the idea of, can you delegate a right you don't have? Like, show a little group of people, if you don't have the right to steal his stuff, can you make it so the guy next to you has the right to steal his stuff? Well, no, obviously not. And so it just, well, what if 3 of you want to steal the stuff? And people can answer yes or people can answer no, and it takes the discussion wherever it goes. There are no dead ends in the flowchart, which is one reason it becomes, massively complicated to make, because people can make the most insane answers ever, and the program doesn't just go, oh, you're too dumb, I give up. It follows through. The only way to all the way finish is to be consistent inside your own head. If you give inconsistent answers like, well, I don't have the right to rob my neighbor, but I do have the right to give a politician the right to rob my neighbor and give it to me. If somebody answers that, it just clarifies the contradiction very gently, nicely. It doesn't say this is a contradiction, but it asks them questions to guide them through it, and then it just leaves it sitting in front of them. Well, you answered this, and then you answered this. Because this program keeps track of their answers so that it can refer back to it. And it's like, well, do you want to change this answer? Or you said this, and you said this. Do you think those match? Stuff like that. Another very important psychological thing is people can totally take their time. I mean, if you're one-on-one and you ask someone a question, what do you think about this? They instantly want to give an answer so they don't sound stupid going, Well, if it's a program, you can sit there for an hour before deciding the answer. And it's made so that you can check out of the application or the program or the whole project, whatever you want to call it, whenever you want and come back whenever you want. So you can go think about a question for a day or a week or a year and then come back and it'll know all the past answers you gave, and it'll pick up where you left off. So there's the 2 huge things that are taking work are the flow chart, where they can give any answer to any questions, and not only does it spread out and the discussion goes wherever it wants, but there are a bunch of fundamental points that the discussion has to get to, so it has to flow in such a way that it'll always get back around, however they answer, it'll get back around to these fundamental points. So it isn't just a free-form wandering off into oblivion discussion that never gets anywhere. And yet the whole time it feels like a smooth back and forth conversation to the individual user. It doesn't just randomly jump to an unrelated question. It always flows. So they feel like they're talking to a human being. But it's different for every user based on their answers. And then the other thing that's going to take a huge amount of work is making this three-dimensional world, the whole thing, and then rendering every single piece, the audio and the video. So for example, you come up to a little display and it gives a little representation and it asks you, well, do you think it's right for this person to do this? And if you say no, then it goes to a different representation and a different question, and it flows. If you say yes, it goes in a different direction. It might physically go into a different direction and show a different representation and something else. Now, that's a thing you can't do with real cameras, but you can with computer-generated graphics. So for the person, it's all one shot. It doesn't cut here and cut there. They are moving through this world. And if they answer yes, then they go that way, which is sort of like a video game. I can choose to go that way. I can choose to go that way. Either way, it's one smooth transition. So this discussion is one smooth linear transition for the user. There's a million ways it could go depending on how they answer. So far, I've designed the world. I haven't put it into the computer, but I finally came up with a design I actually like for the entire world. It involves our subconscious, it involves our memory, it involves our senses, our eyes, our ears, the sensory input, our perceptions and how they change what we're seeing, how the memory changes that. So it's built a little bit like a factory where everything, like memory has an input on our perceptions have an input on our what we're seeing before it gets to our conscious brain, and how it sort of sometimes distorts what we think we're seeing, what we think we're understanding, what's going on. So it's basically this big three-dimensional visual world that I now have the basic structure of the whole thing. That took a while before I got a structure I really liked. So the camera can cruise around in it and explain what's going on. Like, well, here's what we remember, and here are our perceptions, and here's our sensory input, and here's what we believe, here's our belief system, here's our rational processing brain, here's our subconscious. All of them like different shapes and images and colors and textures and stuff to keep it clear in people's heads. Again, it's one of those things that's ridiculously complicated to make, but it feels really simple and straightforward for the user who does it. To him, it's just a back and forth discussion in this cool 3D world where he talks about concepts and he examines his own thought process. I'm not saying it's wrong to argue the practical side or, have those debates or those concepts, but we have to keep in mind human psychology. And if we can't get past all the psychological hurdles to people thinking about this, we lose. It doesn't matter that we have reason and morality on our side. We freaking lose if we can't get people to think about it. And I think this project will do better than anything I've ever seen or ever heard of at getting the maximum number of people to actually think about these things. The 3D world, now that I finally have the general setup, I have to build it inside the computer. So I just have scribbles and sketches, and maybe I should show some of them at least, although they're ugly because mostly it's just notes to myself of how all the pieces fit together, and just build this. It's almost like a city, a three-dimensional city consisting of all the parts of your brain and how it works. And then the flow chart, the major skeleton is basically done. And by that I mean there are a bunch of pieces that we have to get to. All right, we have to cover this topic. So inside that topic there'll be the little flow chart. If they answer yes, you go this way. But you have to get to each one of those topics. So I have all those topics and the order in which it gets from one to another to make it a realistic flowing conversation, no matter what their answers are. So they can answer at random and it'll still be a flowing conversation, which will get to all the necessary points instead of just wandering off onto a tangent and never coming back. And again, I already have a female narrator I want to use for this. And we will record everything so that it's perfect. In a live discussion, you don't get to sit there for an hour thinking, what is the perfect way to word my next question? In this, you do. And for the user, it's real time. He doesn't have to sit there for an hour waiting for it. So it will be the perfect interviewer. Totally gentle, totally passive, not argumentative. Aside from it being, visual, so it's memorable and all that, and gentle, so it's, people don't need to be defensive, they don't need to feel rushed, any of that. They do it one at a time, at their pace, however they feel comfortable. But the challenge was always, well, how do you repeat that? Because if we do that one at a time, yay, I just talked to this person for a couple hours and now he understands that government is bogus. Meanwhile, how many thousands of statists just got born, or thousands of people who are going to be made into statists? We're kind of doomed. And it is spreading quickly, so we're not really completely doomed. But way better than any movie, any video, any book, any article because those are all just unilateral monologues, and somebody has to listen to it and they're not engaged, and they can decide to pay attention if they want to, if they're interested. But it isn't really them. They're not in charge. It's somebody lecturing at them. And people naturally feel like, well, I have my belief system and you're throwing your belief system at me, so I'm going to be on the defensive because your belief system isn't mine. Well, this thing just completely doesn't end around and said, we're only talking about your system. There won't be an external belief system thrown at you here. This is just a way for you to look at your own. So I know how to do it. I already have the software. I don't need any of that. I don't need any of the equipment. And I can do it myself, but it will take a lot of time and effort because I want it to look really good. I want it to look like a studio quality movie that you're going through. Even down to having a music soundtrack, and I have the stuff to do that, so that it feels like a three-dimensional virtual reality movie, only you're guiding where it goes because you're the one answering the questions, and that determines where it physically goes inside this world and where the discussion goes, and what the next question is and all that. So that's the situation. Again, it's a massive project, and for a while it got bigger the more I thought about it. But I have made a bunch of progress now, and I will keep working on it as fast as I can, as much as I can, depending on how much time and energy I have to put into other stuff to make money and pay bills and stuff. But I really think, and I would never do a project this enormous if I didn't, because it'll be another year before this thing is done. If I didn't believe that it really will be more effective than a one-on-one discussion, than me having a one-on-one discussion with somebody. Having 20 years of experience doing that, this will still be worlds ahead of that and way better than that. And instead of one person doing it at a time, 7 billion people could do it at a time. One of the main goals is to have it be so interesting and fun and stuff that people tell other people about it, so you don't have to advertise. Oh, it's free to everybody too. Anybody can just get it and do it for free. But I want people to go, this is so interesting, here, check this out. And people who are already voluntarists can say, here, just do this. Like, you don't have to argue with me and throw things at me and tell me how the world will come to an end without a ruling class. Just do this thing and examine your own belief system and then get back to me and tell me what you think. It can be totally passive invitation. It's not, this will prove you wrong, because that's not at all what it does. So, all right, that's enough ranting for now, but that's where the project stands and kind of what it's all about. Again, there are a million little details because each little thing takes into account psychology and what makes people's brains shut down and what makes people's brain open up so they can think about stuff. It won't have a 100% success rate because there's a lot of boneheads out there who don't want to think and never will. But I think it'll have a way higher success rate than anything else that I've ever heard of or ever seen.